Every old photograph has the same face in it. 150 years of brides, soldiers, farmers, school children, grandmothers, different countries, different decades, different lives. One expression, that flat, hollow stare, as if everyone photographed before 1920 was attending their own funeral. You've probably heard the explanation. Cameras were slow, exposures took minutes, and nobody can hold a smile that long. It's a tidy answer, and it's the one everyone repeats. It's also mostly wrong. Photography became fast enough for smiling within about a decade of being invented. People kept refusing to smile for another 70 years anyway. The real reasons are stranger and darker. They run through rotten teeth, etiquette manuals, mothers disguised as furniture, and some of the most heartbreaking photographs ever taken. Once you understand what that stare actually was, you'll never look at your own camera roll the same way again. The myth didn't come from nowhere. It's half true, and the half matters. In 1826, a French inventor named Nicéphore Niepce created the oldest surviving photograph in the world. The exposure took at least 8 hours. 12 years later, Louis Daguerre photographed a Paris boulevard in the middle of the day. The street was packed with carriages and pedestrians, but the photo shows it nearly empty. Everything that moved vanished from the plate. Everything except one man on a corner, holding still while his boots were polished. He became the first human being ever captured in a photograph. By accident, because he stood still the longest. So yes, the first cameras were brutally slow. Early studios even clamped customers' heads into iron posing stands to stop the trembling. Remember those stands. They come back later in a much darker way. But here's what the exposure story leaves out. The technology got fast almost immediately. In 1840, a mathematician in Vienna named Joseph Petzval designed a portrait lens that gathered around 20 times more light, and chemists sped up the plates with bromine. By the mid-1840s, a portrait took 20 or 30 seconds. By 1878, Eadweard Muybridge was freezing the hooves of a galloping horse in midair. Split-second photography existed before your great-great-grandparents were born. Yet look at portraits from 1880, or 1900, or 1910. The cameras could catch a sneeze. The faces are still stone. And there's an even bigger hole in the myth. Early smiles exist. In 1853, a Welsh photographer named Mary Dillwyn captured a boy named Willie with a grin on his face, one of the earliest photographed smiles in history. So people could smile for the camera. They chose not to. Decade after decade, in the millions. When an entire civilization keeps making the same choice for 70 years, that's not a shutter speed problem. That's a belief. So people reach for a second explanation. The teeth. This one is true, catastrophically true. Sugar was cheap, dentistry barely existed, and the average mouth of the 1800s was a disaster. A bad tooth usually met a pair of pliers, often operated by the local barber. Dentures were carved from ivory, or assembled from something worse, the real teeth of dead soldiers. After the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, so many teeth were pulled from the battlefield dead that dentures across Europe got a nickname. Waterloo teeth. Angus Trumbull, who ran Australia's National Portrait Gallery and wrote an entire history of the smile, put it bluntly. People had lousy teeth, if they had teeth at all, and it kept their mouths shut in social settings. Cameras raised the stakes. A portrait painter could quietly fix your smile. A photograph showed exactly what was in your mouth, forever. But teeth can't be the whole engine. Nearly everyone's teeth were bad. It was the default state of a human mouth. About as embarrassing as owning a phone charger is today. And the people with fine teeth didn't smile either. Neither did children whose teeth were brand new. Something deeper was going on. To find it, you have to ask what a photograph actually meant to the person standing in front of the camera. It did not mean what it means to you. For centuries before photography, there was exactly one way to preserve your face: paint. A painted portrait was wildly expensive, reserved for royalty, bishops, and merchants. Across all those centuries of European portraiture, almost nobody is smiling. Look at who does grin in old paintings. Drunks in taverns, beggars, fools, children. A wide open smile was the mark of someone at the bottom. Someone with no dignity left to protect. The Mona Lisa hypnotized the world for 5 centuries with barely a flicker at the corner of her mouth. At the top of society, that flicker was the legal limit. There were actual rules about this. An etiquette manual from 1703 warned that polite people never uncover their teeth because nature gave us lips to conceal them. A big smile meant losing control of your own face. It was the expression of the madman, the drunk, the simpleton. English still carries the fossil of that judgment, grinning like an idiot. Then photography arrived, and it didn't arrive as a toy, it arrived as cheap painting. When Richard Beard opened Britain's first portrait studio on a London rooftop in 1841, he charged a guinea a picture, about a week's wages for a skilled workman. So you didn't take photos. You took a photo, quite possibly the only one of your entire life. You saved for it, dressed in your Sunday best, and stared into the lens knowing this single frozen image was the version of you your great-grandchildren would inherit. It was your face for eternity, and eternity was a formal occasion. The studios treated it that way. Some of the earliest ones called their camera rooms operating rooms, and photographers told customers to pose before the instrument, which is the bedside manner of a surgeon, not a birthday party. Instead of cheese, sitters were told to say prunes, a word that pulled the lips into a small, tight, fashionable mouth. The goal of a portrait wasn't joy, it was composure. Mark Twain, the funniest man in America, was photographed constantly, and never with a grin. His reasoning survives. A photograph is a most important document, he wrote, and there is nothing more damning to go down to posterity than a silly, foolish smile caught and fixed forever. That was the logic, coming from a professional humorist. A smile lasts a second, a photograph lasts forever. Nobody wanted to be caught wearing a moment. None of this means these people were miserable. Their letters and diaries are full of jokes and laughter. Trumbull found that Victorians smiled in private exactly like we do. But a portrait wasn't private. It was the most public thing that would ever happen to your face. And for too many families, the camera arrived at the worst moment of their lives. Here's the part of the story that rarely gets told. In the mid-1800s, roughly 1 child in 4 didn't live to see a 5th birthday. A photograph cost a week's pay, so families put it off. There would be time next year when money was easier. Then scarlet fever came through town, or cholera, or typhoid, and suddenly there was no next year, which is how photography took on a job we've almost erased from its history. Photographing the dead. Postmortem photography was normal in the mid-1800s. Parents dressed their child one last time, laid them on a bed, or cradled them in their arms, and paid a photographer to come to the house. The children were often posed as if sleeping. Sometimes the photographer tinted the cheeks on the finished print, or painted open eyes over closed lids. For thousands of families, this was the only photograph of that person that would ever exist. One image made after it was too late, standing in for an entire life. Now, remember those iron posing stands? The internet has decided they're evidence of something ghoulish. You've probably seen the posts. A stiff Victorian figure, the base of a stand visible behind their feet, and a caption claiming you're looking at a propped-up corpse. It's almost always false. A posing stand is built like a microphone stand. It steadied living heads, and it cannot hold the dead weight of a human body. Collectors of genuine postmortem photographs say it flatly. Standing corpse portraits basically don't exist. The dead were photographed lying down. So the stand in the picture proves the opposite of the caption. That person was alive. They just looked dead to modern eyes because that's how rigidly living Victorians held themselves for a camera. We can no longer tell their living faces from their dead ones. And the dead weren't even the strangest subjects of the era. Babies wouldn't hold still, and they couldn't be clamped. The solution was for the mother to become furniture. She would sit in the frame draped head to toe in dark cloth, or disguised as an armchair, gripping her baby with hidden hands to hold it steady for the lens. They're called hidden mother photographs, and they were made by the thousands into the 1920s. An artist named Linda Fregney Nagler collected more than 1,000 of them into a book. Once you've seen one, you spot them instantly. A serene baby, propped against a lumpy black shape that has arms. Parents often commissioned these while a child was sickly, terrified they wouldn't get another chance. That's the world early photography lived in. The camera stood next to the coffin more often than the birthday cake. It was the machine you summoned when you needed a face to outlast a life. Nobody grins at that machine. So how did we get from there to birthday parties and beach selfies? It took 3 inventions, and only one of them was a camera. In 1888, George Eastman launched Kodak with the slogan, "You press the button, we do the rest." In 1900 came the Brownie, a cardboard box camera that cost $1, roughly $40 in today's money. For the first time in history, an ordinary family could photograph an ordinary Tuesday. But Kodak understood something deeper. To sell cameras by the million, photography had to mean something new. Media scholar Kristina Kochemedova traced how deliberately the company did it. Out went the operating room. In came decades of ads showing picnics, holidays, beaches, children mid-laugh. One relentless message: cameras belong to happy moments. Even the vocabulary changed. The formal portrait gave way to the snapshot, a word borrowed from hunting, a shot fired quickly, without careful aim. The second invention was the movie screen. By the 1920s, Hollywood was projecting faces 30 feet tall, and its stars smiled for a living. The most looked at humans on Earth were suddenly the grinning ones. The third was the toothpaste ad. Modern dentistry and brands like Pepsodent spent the 1910s and 20s selling teeth as something to be proud of. The mouth went from a private embarrassment to a product. A camera in every house, a grin on every screen, and teeth worth showing. Together, they rewired what a photographed face was for. You can literally watch it happen. Researchers at Berkeley ran nearly 38,000 American high school yearbook photos taken between 1905 and 2013 through software that measured the curve of every mouth. The curve climbs decade after decade and never falls back. Flat lips in 1905, a faint softening in the 20s, real smiles by mid-century, and the widest grins in the dataset after 2000. Women led men in every single decade. By the Second World War, the flip was complete. Soldiers shipped out with smiling snapshots of their sweethearts tucked into their uniforms. And in 1943, a Texas newspaper printed a trick for looking pleasant in pictures, courtesy of the former ambassador Joseph Davies. Just say cheese, he advised. He claimed he'd learned it from an astute politician and wouldn't name him. He worked for Franklin Roosevelt. People drew their own conclusions. In 1 century, the instruction had fully inverted, from prunes to cheese, from hiding your teeth to bearing them. Same technology, pointed at the same species. The only thing that changed was what everyone believed a photograph was. Which brings us back to that stare. The people in old photographs weren't depressed, and they weren't paralyzed by slow shutters. They were doing something deliberate, presenting the one version of themselves that would exist after they were gone. Composed, dignified, permanent. A portrait was their single shot at forever, and they dressed their face for it. Now, count how many photographs exist of you. Not the ones you posed for. All of them. Tagged photos, group chats, the backgrounds of strangers' vacation pictures, the thousands sitting in your camera roll. You've probably been photographed more times this month than a Victorian was in a lifetime. And in almost every posed shot, you're wearing your own century's uniform, the camera smile. It snaps on half a second before the shutter and dies half a second after, whether or not you're happy. At parties, at graduations, at funerals with the family gathered one last time, a camera has never really photographed feelings. It photographs the rules for showing them. That's why those old faces feel so haunting. You're not looking at sadness. You're looking at people who believed a photograph was a message to eternity, holding perfectly still so the message would arrive. They got one picture to say who they were, and they meant every second of it. You'll get about 10,000, and you'll say cheese.